Okay, so the question is, for those of you who couldn't hear it, if I were to give advice to the new president, what would one or two of those pieces of advice be? That's obviously something I'm thinking about a great deal, and it's also something that I'm not completely qualified to do. So these are more hints followed by guesses rather than anything more exacting. But I would say that the first thing that the United States administration needs to do is to put Afghanistan in context. There is a slight tendency to try to treat it in isolation, to try to say, oh, well, we happen to be in Afghanistan, we happen to be in Iraq, therefore those countries, the be-all and end-all, and we'll pump a lot of resources into them. I think the opportunity for President Obama is actually to look at American strategic priorities much more broadly and see why or how Afghanistan matters. So from a brutal perspective of national security, I think you might begin by saying that if you're worried about terrorism, Pakistan is probably more important than Afghanistan. If you're worried about regional stability, it would probably turn out that Egypt, Iran, Iraq, even Lebanon are more important in terms of stability than the Middle East. If you're worried about poverty, Africa is very important. Now, I'm aware that in saying this, I'm slightly cutting the ground out from under my own feet, because I and my colleagues would like you to believe that Afghanistan is the only place that matters, because so long as you believe Afghanistan is the only place that matters, you'll continue to support us in the way we wish to be supported. Nevertheless, that clearly isn't true. I mean, the United States, playing its current role, needs, for example, to determine what its attitude is towards China. China's too powerful, too wealthy to be intimidated by the United States, so it needs to work out what its interests are in the Asia-Pacific region and what it's going to do about them. Beginning from that, which I think would probably lead to detachment, which would probably lead to a conclusion which would say that you cannot justify putting hundreds of times more investment into Afghanistan than you do into other countries which matter equally, might be quite useful. Because I personally believe that what we need in our relationship with Afghanistan is a much longer-term relationship. What we need is a relationship which stretches over 20 or 30 years. It was very dangerous what we did in 1989. In 1989, the Charlie Wilson war effect, we went from $1 billion a year to zero. And I'm very afraid we're going to do it again. We have a track record over 150 years, the West going into countries like Afghanistan, pumping in a lot of money and resources, and then leaving again immediately. So that Afghanistan goes from boom to bust perpetually. At the moment, about 90% of the legal economy in Afghanistan is provided by international aid. If you were to cut that off, the entire country would collapse. You wouldn't be able to pay the school teachers, you wouldn't be able to keep the clinics going, etc. In order to keep investment over 20 or 30 years, though, you cannot do so at the current rate. I think we have decided to put unsustainable amount of troops and money in. I'm frightened by it. I'm frightened because I think the danger about what we're doing at the moment is that in 3 or 4 years' time, American voters or European voters are going to turn around and say, forget it. We'll go from engagement to isolation, from troop increases to withdrawal. I would like to see us try to define, and this is very unfashionable at the moment, but I would like to see us try to define a lighter footprint, because I think only a lighter footprint is sustainable. You're not going to be able to keep 80, 90,000 international troops there. We have to work out what we can do with less. And there may be some benefits of that. One of them is that an unintended consequence of that is, of course, it puts the Afghan government in the lead. The international community's role there, although frequently they're trying to be helpful, they're not always trying to be helpful, but frequently they are trying to be helpful, is often in effect to marginalize the Afghan government, because there are tens of thousands of foreigners running around duplicating the work of the Afghan government, undermining their authority, creating parallel structures. So drawing down on the number of foreigners might be useful in terms of boosting the credibility and the prestige of the Afghan government. Secondly, we have to be honest, there is a problem. There's a problem in southern Afghanistan, which is that many of the Pashtun villages are much more conservative, much more anti-foreign than we like to acknowledge. These communities do not want to see something which they would perceive as a foreign military occupation. We cannot allow ourselves to be perceived like that. If we're perceived like that, we're on a hiding to nothing. And that's another reason why I think we have to be quite cautious about these kinds of troop deployments. So I suppose those are the two things. Firstly, Afghanistan in context. Secondly, probably a lighter but much longer term and more sustainable presence. Thank you. Please. Okay, so the question was, what is the solution to the heroin problem? It seems to the questioner as though if we cannot solve that, we will not be able to solve any of the problems in Afghanistan. Well, the answer, of course, is we don't know what the solution is to the heroin problem. Right? It's a very, very difficult issue. We keep, every time a friend of mine flies out from Finland or flies out from Britain to join the British Embassy counter-narcotics team, which is now up to about 100 people, they step off the airplane and they have a brilliant new idea. And generally the idea is this. Generally they say, it occurs to me that the farmers are only making $150 a kilo, and therefore the acre value of their crop is only about $800. So if they were to grow, and then queue every year a different crop, it's like the Milan fashion walks, every year a different color. So if they were to grow legal poppy, or last year if they were to grow saffron, or the year before if they were to grow apricots, or the year before that if they were to grow unsubsidized wheat, or the year before that if they were to grow roses, they would be able to make more money, and therefore they wouldn't grow the poppy. Unfortunately, this process is not new in Afghanistan. I have a friend here in San Francisco who was working on this issue during the Carter administration in the late 1970s in Pakistan and Afghanistan. The idea of these alternative crops is nothing new. And the problem is that it's not just a question of the per kilo value or the acre value. The poppy crop is very useful. You can store it for 2 or 3 years in a way that you can't store apricots. You can transport it down bad, bumpy roads in a way that you can't transport apricots down a bad, bumpy road. And furthermore, of course, there are considerable pressures on you as a farmer from some very nasty people to grow poppy when they're not very interested in you growing apricots. The long-term solution, of course, would require two things. It would require, firstly, rule of law. It would require a proper police force. It would require a judicial system that functioned, proper prisons. And secondly, it would require sustainable economic development. It would require some other form of income generation. Now, that's why, of course, I'm very interested in this project in Kabul, because we are trying hard to generate alternative incomes. We can sell these wooden rooms to the Connaught Hotel in London for about $100,000. We're working with British designers on jewelry, which allow us to sell our jewelry at international market rates. This can generate very serious incomes for people. The handicraft industry in Afghanistan is now the second largest industry in the country. Afghan carpets are winning international awards at Berlin shows. It is not a total solution, though. It's a very partial solution. We could, if we were lucky, with enough investment in the craft industry, create perhaps 150,000 jobs over the next 4 to 5 years. But that's not going to deal with a population of 28 million people. That will come much, much more slowly. And the question is observation, which is that without dealing with it, we're going to be in a lot of trouble, remains true. There are many structural issues, of which counter-narcotics is one of them, which seem very, very difficult for the West to resolve. And of course, without any resolution, it's going to be very difficult to move forward. This doesn't mean that it can't be resolved. The Taliban in 2001 basically eliminated the entire poppy crop from the country. And that's an interesting fact. It's a difficult fact because we don't like the Taliban. There were many elements in the way in which they did that which we wouldn't like. But it at least suggests that it is possible. In Nangarhar, province in eastern Afghanistan, Gulagh Shizai, who is a very colorful figure, sort of warlord figure, has basically eliminated the entire poppy crop from his province overnight because he decided to do so. It can be done, but the question is how one gets the leverage to do it, and we certainly don't have that leverage at the moment.